Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleep Science. Tonight, you're not just curling up in bed, you're curling back through time, way back. No mammoths, no pyramids, no humans humming around with smartphones. The sky overhead is thicker, almost greenish with moisture, and the air tastes wilder. You're standing barefoot in a forest that hasn't existed for hundreds of millions of years. Ferns taller than houses sway gently in the wind. Something enormous rustles behind a vine-covered tree trunk, but it's not the starring act tonight. You're not here to run from dinosaurs. You're here to meet the neighbors who may have invented civilization long before the first human made fire. And here's the kicker: you probably won't survive this. Not the walk. You're safe enough nestled under your covers. But the realization, the idea that someone may have come before us and vanished without a trace, might scramble your sense of historical certainty forever. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always comforting to see where and when everyone's drifting off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes in a world untouched by humans, not even a rumor of them. There's no chatter of early hominids in the trees, no spark of a campfire, nothing even vaguely bipedal, but still, something feels organized. The arrangement of vines overhead twists in patterns that seem almost too regular. The way the moss grows in ringed spirals, or how that stream down the hill flows with unnatural symmetry. You tell yourself it's probably just nature being weird again. But then again, you've seen what humans call cities. Some of them barely make it past 2 centuries before crumbling into moss and concrete slop. If a civilization had existed hundreds of millions of years ago, built by something else entirely, how would you even begin to look for it? The rock layers here are thick with stories, but they don't whisper in English. They speak in the slow language of erosion, mineral replacement, and geological pressure. There's no writing, no monuments, no subway maps carved in stone. But there's atmosphere, there's movement. Something intelligent might have passed through this very forest, back when it was a shallow sea. Or an arid plateau. The continents have shifted so much, it's impossible to keep a fixed address here. Historians and paleontologists agree on one thing: humans didn't invent the planet's first structures. Nature did. Termites, bees, corals. Long before we were etching plans on blueprints, other creatures were making hives, reefs, and meganests with architectural precision. But here's where it gets deliciously speculative. What if one of them didn't stop at instinct? What if some ancient life form started asking questions, designing not just for function, but for meaning? You wade through this thought like mist. Every tree trunk seems to lean in a little. You recall that octopuses, yes, octopuses, have been shown to use tools, recognize patterns, and solve puzzles. They're soft-bodied, short-lived, and weirdly brilliant. Now imagine if they'd had 300 million years instead of just a few thousand to explore their cognitive potential. Sure, it sounds like a sci-fi B-movie, until you remember that Earth has had so much time before us. If the entire age of the planet were a 24-hour clock, humans only show up in the last few seconds. Everything else, fair game. Entire epochs have come and gone with room to spare. That's a lot of unmonitored silence. But why haven't we found the ruins, the satellites, the plastic bottle caps? Well, maybe you're thinking too human. The ruins wouldn't look like ours. They might have been grown, not built, digested rather than mined. The bottle caps, maybe they used materials that dissolved entirely, organic polymers or engineered bio-waste that became nutrients instead of garbage. The satellites, maybe they were subterranean. Maybe they thought looking outward was a waste of energy and the real cosmos was beneath their feet. Remember that cheeky phrase from earlier, "You probably won't survive this." This is where it really hits, not because of physical danger, but because once you let in the idea that Earth's first civilization wasn't human, the whole framework of progress gets a little wobbly. You're not the pinnacle of evolution. You're just the most recent data entry. And if someone did come first, where are they now? The forest goes quiet. You hear a low hum, maybe wind, maybe something else. You crouch next to a tangle of roots that spirals outward in 6 perfect arms. Not 5, not 7, 6. Uniform, intentional. You tell yourself it's coincidence. You always do. Here's a little historical nugget to chew on. The oldest known city humans ever built, Jericho, is around 11,000 years old. That's not even a blip on geological time. Meanwhile, Earth's crust contains rocks over 4 billion years old. That's 4,000 million. You could lose dozens of entire civilizations in that margin and never see a trace. And here's a fringe morsel. Some researchers believe there are patterns in Earth's fossil and sedimentary record that could be the result of unnatural activities, chemical residues, isotope anomalies, sudden carbon spikes. Nothing confirmed, of course. Historians still argue whether these could be ancient industrial signatures or just the tantrums of a planet in flux. You sit back, let the wind rustle your imaginary hair. Something out here existed long before us. Maybe it built, maybe it thought, maybe it dreamed. But unlike us, it didn't leave breadcrumbs. Or maybe we just never learned how to read them. You press your hand into the damp forest floor and feel not just mud, but time. So much time it warps your sense of scale. You're no longer thinking in centuries or millennia. You're thinking in epochs. The thick, loamy smell of decay rises all around you, layered with something sharper, ozone, maybe, or the ghost of a forgotten industry. It's as though the air itself remembers something you never learned. So how do you even begin to explore the idea that civilization might have emerged before humans? The first step is a change in mindset. You don't look for roads and ruins. You look for interruptions, breaks in the natural order, clues too weird, too timely, too convenient to be chance. And that's where the idea of deep time intelligence begins to wiggle into the scientific conversation. Not loudly, not officially, but it's there, hovering in the background like a polite cough at a very serious geology conference. You pause at the edge of a shallow ravine, watching water trickle over striped stone. The stripes are layers of sediment, like a cake, if cakes were baked under tectonic pressure for 1 billion years. These layers record everything: floods, droughts, extinctions. But what about intelligence? Could a civilization leave fingerprints deep in this record without us recognizing them? That's the question planetary scientists Gavin Schmidt and Adam Frank posed in what's now known as the Silurian hypothesis, a name cheekily borrowed from a race of intelligent reptiles in Doctor Who. The idea: if a non-human industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions, or hundreds of millions, of years ago, what signs would it have left in the geologic record? And more importantly, would we even be able to detect them? You sit with that thought for a moment, literally. The stone beneath you is Devonian, around 400 million years old. At that time, plants were just beginning to spread across the land. The first forests were forming. Fish were experimenting with limbs. And according to the fossil record, nothing even close to intelligent was writing symphonies or inventing algebra. But that's assuming intelligence has to look like us, that it has to talk, write, wear lab coats, that it has to leave behind monuments. What if the civilization was subtle, biointegrated, rooted in life systems rather than bricks and steel? Historians still argue whether industrial development is a natural endpoint of intelligence, Or just one bizarre root out of many? Could there be minds that never discovered metallurgy, but mastered molecular biology? Beings that never went to the moon, but engineered their planet's climate more precisely than we ever could? The Silurian hypothesis points out that most of our own industrial footprint, from cities to landfills, would vanish in a few million years. Plastic breaks down, concrete crumbles, skyscrapers fall. What lasts are chemical signatures, isotope ratios, trace metals, sudden carbon spikes. And wouldn't you know it, some of those do appear in the record. The Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, for example, around 56 million years ago, shows a sudden global warming event, massive carbon release, and changes in sediment that we still don't fully understand. Coincidence? Probably, maybe. It could have been volcanic activity or methane hydrate release. But what if it was? You glance down at the stone again. It's not whispering any secrets, but it's been keeping them. Let's sprinkle in a little historical contrast to ground us. The ancient Sumerians, often hailed as humanity's first true civilization, left behind clay tablets, cities, irrigation systems, all in the last 6,000 years. But those tablets could crumble, the cities could erode, and if Earth shrugged them off in a great tectonic yawn, poof, gone. Now multiply that disappearance by 100 million years. That's how much time could separate us from an earlier civilization. And that's where your brain starts to melt a little. Imagine a world, say, 200 million years ago. The continents are in different places. The animals are strange. You're sharing the land with creatures like Cynaegnathus and Coelophysis, not quite dinosaurs, not quite mammals. But maybe, just maybe, something in the shadows had already started stacking stones or brewing fermentation. Maybe something clever was watching the stars flicker and counting the moons. But even if it had happened, how would we know? That's the unsettling part. We might not. And here's your quirky fact of the night. In the early 20th century, a curious object was reportedly found embedded in a lump of coal, an iron pot. Yes, you heard that right. A pot. In coal. Of course, it's never been officially verified and most likely belongs in the interesting but unprovable pile. Still, stories like that float around, uneasily wedged between fringe conspiracy and legitimate mystery. You wonder if people dismiss such anomalies not because they're fake, but because they're too annoying. Too inconvenient for the tidy boxes science prefers to sort its data into. Kind of like finding a USB stick at a Roman dig site. It breaks the story. It ruins the narrative. So we gently forget it. But not you. You're still here, crouched beside a gnarled root system that looks oddly sculpted. You reach out and feel the texture smooth, too smooth. But when you blink again, it's just bark. Or is it? You lean back and stare up at the tree canopy. The stars beyond twinkle in strange configurations. They've moved over millions of years. You wonder if anyone else once looked up at them from this very spot, imagining gods, making plans, dreaming of flight. Maybe their dreams ended in silence. Maybe they transcended. Or maybe, just maybe, they left behind more than we realize, waiting for someone with enough curiosity to look in the right way. The forest exhales. You breathe with it. Something ancient stirs not in the underbrush but in your thoughts. And the question lingers, quieter now, but no less haunting. What if the first great minds of Earth were never human at all? You walk now, slow and deliberate, along a ridge of stone that's older than mammals. Beneath your feet lie the compressed remains of worlds long vanished. Oceans turn to shale, forests turn to coal, creatures turn to ghosts. It's a hauntingly solid place to contemplate something utterly uncertain. If a civilization had once ruled this planet millions of years before humans, what kind of fingerprints would it leave in the crust? That's where the Silurian hypothesis really stretches its legs. We teased the name last time. Yes, the nod to Doctor Who is intentional. In that story, a race of intelligent reptiles, the Silurians, evolved on Earth before humans went underground and eventually resurfaced. Sci-fi fodder, right? But in real-world science, the hypothesis does something bold. It asks not whether such beings existed, but whether we would even know if they had. Spoiler, the answer might be no. You crouch near a layered outcrop and run your hand along the striated surface, millions of years compressed into inches. Some of these layers are ancient seafloors, others are river deltas or volcanic ash falls. The variety is staggering, but the silence is louder. There's no rebar, no ruins, no billboards, no fossilized coffee shops. Still, some geochemists think we might find indirect evidence, just not the kind that screams, "Hey, here's a dinosaur iPad." The Silurian hypothesis focuses on anomalies. Think weird shifts in carbon isotopes, unexplained temperature spikes, and sudden changes in sediment composition that don't match known natural events. If a civilization had, say, triggered global warming through industry or released synthetic chemicals into the environment, those might still echo in the rocks. Here, where it gets interesting, one layer from about 56 million years ago, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum pedum, shows a sudden, extreme warming event, along with a massive carbon influx and species die-offs. Some think this was caused by methane hydrates or volcanic activity, but others quietly wonder, what if it wasn't natural at all? Historians still argue whether the PETM was purely geological, or a buried signal from someone's industrial mistake. You tilt your head. It's a seductive thought, but also maddening, because if it was a civilization, there's nothing else left. No monuments, no tools, no language, just a strange line in the rocks and a warm planet gasping for breath. One joke that often floats around among planetary scientists is, you know your species made it when you leave behind your own extinction layer. You laugh softly. It's dark humor, but not wrong. Our own modern industrial age has already started to carve its mark. Future geologists, assuming there are any, might call our current stratum the Plasticene. Traces of plastics, concrete dust, rare earth metals, and synthetic hormones are sinking into sediments all over the globe. If we were to vanish tomorrow, those would remain. For a while. Maybe a few million years. But even those traces would eventually break down, buried, melted, forgotten. Now picture a civilization that existed 100 million years ago. How long did it last? 1,000 years? 10,000? That's a blip. That's a fingernail clipping on the timeline. If it had burned brightly and briefly, the record might look exactly like the PETM. A sudden spike, a disturbance, a return to silence. Let's insert your historical anchor. Back in 1822, humans discovered the first dinosaur tooth. Before that, there was no word for dinosaur. People thought giant bones belonged to dragons or fallen giants. That was just 200 years ago. You shake your head and smile. If we could be so wrong about something lying just beneath our feet, what might we be missing entirely? Now for your fringe flavor of the night. A few odd mineral structures have been found in extremely ancient rocks, some over 1 billion years old, that look suspiciously like manufactured spheres. Perfect symmetry, grooved bands, dismissed as concretions or geofacts by most, of course. Nature can be a precise artist when the chemistry is right. But once in a while, a researcher will frown, lean closer, and ask, are we sure this isn't artificial? You keep walking, brushing past ferns the size of SUVs. The landscape shifts. The light dims slightly. You pass a rocky ledge that looks wrong, too flat, too smooth. You tell yourself it's just erosion, just a quirk. But part of you wonders if it was once a landing pad, or a platform, or a foundation for something now long crumbled into myth. The hypothesis also explores why detecting a pre-human civilization is so hard. Earth is active. It recycles its crust. Oceans rise and fall. Continents break and reform like Lego bricks. Even with our modern cities and massive population, only a tiny percentage of our footprint will remain in the geologic record after 10 million years. If you want a humbling stat, 99.9999% of what we've built would vanish. The rest, possibly mistaken for a lava formation. You pause at a cracked boulder etched with natural grooves, or maybe not so natural, it almost looks like writing. You blink. It doesn't resolve, just weathering, you tell yourself. But the seed of doubt is planted. Remember, we only know about our civilization because we're inside of it. We see it being made, maintained, archived. But if it were a fossil, most of it would be noise, erased, fragmented, impossible to parse. The Silurian hypothesis doesn't claim there was a prior civilization. It simply poses a chilling and elegant question. If one had existed, how would we know? You let the silence answer. The air feels heavier now. Not threatening, just older, a kind of gravity of memory. You stare out over a valley that's been underwater, forested, glaciated, and burned, all before you ever stepped into it. Somewhere in that tumult, maybe someone else stood here once, looking down, thinking. And maybe they asked the same question you just whispered. Are we the first? You find yourself descending into a canyon now, each careful footstep taking you further into time, as if the rock walls on either side are opening like pages in some colossal geological diary. But instead of stories written in ink, these chapters are told in color bands. Red from iron, white from ancient salt flats, dark gray from the breathless beds of dead oceans. The deeper you go, the quieter it becomes. Not just quiet in the no birds chirping sense, but in the deep, insulating silence of untouched time. The kind of silence that seems to hum. You follow that hum. You listen to it with more than just your ears. You're in the strata now, the Earth's memory banks. And if someone had been here before us, this is where you'd look. The Silurian hypothesis may be all theory and no smoking gun, but it does tell us where to sniff around. It suggests we look for what it calls non-biological anomalies. That means spikes in carbon dioxide, synthetic isotopes, unusual trace metals, anything that looks like a blip in Earth's otherwise natural rhythm, like suddenly finding glitter in your compost heap. And here, where it gets deliciously weird, because there are blips, the PETM we talked about, but also smaller, stranger ones. Layers that contain odd concentrations of rare elements, like iridium, which is often linked to meteor impacts, but also happens to be used in some modern electronics. Historians still argue whether these traces are natural deposits or something less organic, mining waste, industrial runoff, the fossilized sneeze of a long-dead reactor. You press your hand against the wall and feel the faintest shimmer of heat. Not actual warmth, just the suggestion of ancient energy sunk into stone. Maybe volcanic, maybe not. The rocks here are Cambrian, over 500 million years old. At that time, life on Earth was exploding into wild new forms. Trilobites scuttled across sea floors. Jelly-like creatures pulsed in shallow lagoons. No trees, no birds, no mammals. And yet, one layer above, just slightly newer, is a thin band rich in metals. Cobalt, nickel, palladium, all useful for high-tech applications, if you had the thumbs for it, or the tentacles. You raise an eyebrow, not that you have a lab on you, of course, but the rocks seem eager to share secrets if only someone asks the right questions. Let's drop in your historical fun fact. During World War II, Allied geologists deliberately mapped global supplies of bauxite and chromite, materials essential for planes and weapons. Why? Because even in wartime, whoever controls the minerals controls the machines. Now imagine a civilization from deep time doing the same, mapping their planet, extracting specific ores, leaving behind faint trails of high-concentration residue. If they reached an industrial phase, even briefly, they'd have left scars. Not ruins, maybe, but signatures. Of course, these signatures would be sparse. Erosion, tectonics, and bioturbation, a fancy word for worms and roots ruining nice, clean sediment makes sure of that. But not everything gets swallowed. Some layers, especially those buried fast under silt or frozen in anaerobic conditions, can preserve shocking details. Which brings us to your fringe nugget of the night. In 1912, miners in Oklahoma allegedly found a small, cube-shaped metallic object embedded in coal estimated to be over 300 million years old. Now, the scientific community largely dismisses it as a hoax or a misidentification. But the story persists in that stubborn space between curiosity and nonsense. And something about that shape, a perfect cube, just lingers in the imagination. You reach the canyon floor and pause. The stream here flows over a flat slab that seems polished, not just smoothed by water, but polished like a table. You crouch and run your fingers over it. No tool marks, no writing, but the symmetry is eerie. Maybe it's a trick of the light, or maybe someone long ago wanted this surface to reflect the sky. Let's get nerdy for a second. If a prior civilization had mastered nuclear technology, for example, that would leave behind specific markers, such as radioactive isotopes with very long half-lives, or unusual concentrations of technetium or plutonium in isolated pockets. Problem is, most of those materials decay, diffuse, or get buried. And if their industry wasn't nuclear at all, say, bioengineered or chemical, we might never notice. Historians still debate whether intelligence inevitably leads to industry. Maybe not. Maybe you get a civilization that never invents the combustion engine, but still knows how to encode thought into molecules. That doesn't build skyscrapers, but reprograms the DNA of trees to grow into towers. If that's what came first, we might be standing on their ruins right now, disguised as forest. You glance at the cliff face again. Those layers really do look unnaturally level, like bricks in a wall built for titans. You squint. Could be natural, probably is, probably. It's like trying to solve a puzzle when someone's melted all the pieces together. But every now and then, one piece seems to almost click. Almost. You shift your gaze upward. There far above, a bird glides through the mist. Wait, not a bird. Something older. Something with membranous wings and a long, twitching tail. Just a shadow of thought, probably. But the idea that another species once ruled this planet and ruled it well feels less like fantasy and more like a forgotten chapter. You lean back against the wall. The stone is cool, solid, quiet. You let your eyes drift closed and imagine. A city made not of concrete but coral, lights that glow like jellyfish, roads that breathe, architecture tuned to seismic vibrations. A civilization so attuned to its planet its footprint looks like a forest, or a reef, or a whisper. And if that's what they left behind, no wonder we missed it. You lie back on the polished slab of stone, letting the ceiling of the canyon stretch overhead like the dome of some ancient cathedral, one built not by hands but by eons. You're suspended between epochs now, drifting through possibilities like sediment in a slow current. This isn't your timeline anymore. It never really was. Let's entertain something bold tonight. Who had the opportunity to be first? It's one thing to imagine signs of a lost civilization, but who, what, could have actually been around to build one? To answer that, you'll need to push back beyond the comfortable boundaries of prehistory. Forget mammoths. Forget apes. You need to look deep into the Paleozoic and Mesozoic, the true forgotten ages, where life got creative in the most outrageous ways. Start with a bit of paleontological trivia. The dinosaurs ruled Earth for roughly 165 million years. That's more than 800 times longer than Homo sapiens have existed. If time were a house party, humans are the guests who just showed up and already spilled soda on the carpet. Dinosaurs owned the building, installed the floor, and hosted brunch every Sunday. So if there was ever a window for someone to rise before us, it was then. Let's start with the usual suspect, theropods, the two-legged, often meat-eating dinosaurs. Yes, including your old pal the velociraptor. Contrary to their Jurassic Park reputation, these creatures were small, likely feathered, and disturbingly clever. Some even had strong binocular vision, semi-opposable fingers, and brain-to-body size ratios higher than most reptiles. Now, no one's saying a velociraptor was sketching blueprints in the sand. But evolution doesn't stand still. Had the asteroid missed, or had climate shifts nudged things differently, it's not unthinkable that some of these species could have continued developing cognitive complexity. In fact, a Canadian paleontologist named Dale Russell once proposed a speculative creature called the dinosauroid. An evolutionary what? If imagining how a troodontid dinosaur might have evolved if given another few million years. The result? A bipedal, large-brained, eerily humanoid being. Historians still argue whether this projection is plausible or just human egotism wearing scales. After all, not all intelligence needs to evolve into something that looks like a gray alien from 1980s pop culture. But troodontids were smart. They had grasping hands. They had the curiosity, the raw potential. So here's your thought experiment. What if one lineage of dinosaur crossed the cognitive threshold? Not writing novels, maybe, but solving problems, working cooperatively, using tools. What if they began to manipulate their environment, not just survive in it? What would they have made? Not cities, necessarily. Maybe burrows, maybe organic constructs, maybe elevated nests arranged in geometric patterns, like how some birds today still decorate their homes with color-coded found objects. Or maybe they didn't build at all. Maybe they cultivated, guided ecosystems, selected certain plants or insects, created feedback loops that sustained their needs. You might scoff, but termites today build towering mounds with internal temperature regulation. Beavers engineer entire landscapes, and they do it without spreadsheets. So now picture a creature with that kind of environmental instinct, plus increasing intelligence. Over tens of millions of years, that's enough time for culture to emerge, spread, and vanish without a trace. But reptiles aren't the only candidates. Rewind further. Swim backward through time into the Devonian seas. Here, strange things are happening in the shallows. Meet the cephalopods, the ancestors of today's octopuses, cuttlefish, and squid. These squishy, boneless enigmas have been around for over 500 million years, long before trees, long before bones, really. And they are smart. Modern octopuses can open jars, escape sealed tanks, use tools, and solve puzzles that would frustrate a bored toddler. Now imagine a version of them that wasn't limited to a short lifespan. Imagine one that lived for decades, that developed a social structure, that passed information down generations, perhaps not through writing, but through behavioral mimicry or encoded bioluminescent language. And here's your quirky fact for tonight. Some researchers have found fossilized remains of giant cephalopod beaks from the Mesozoic era, suggesting individuals far larger than anything alive today. Some of these, nicknamed kraken-like by the more poetic paleontologists, may have been the apex predators of their time. So here's a twist. What if your first civilization wasn't terrestrial at all? What if it lived in the oceans? Think about it. Water is more stable than land. Sea levels change, sure, but it's easier to hide from extinction down there. Easier to evolve in peace. Harder for your remains to fossilize, though, especially if you're soft-bodied and built with biodegradable materials. A true double-edged tentacle. Historians still debate whether intelligence could flourish in such an environment. No fire, for one. No metallurgy. But that's assuming fire and metal are necessary at all. What if chemistry came first? What if they grew their structures, bred their machines, wove life into architecture? Suddenly you remember that theory, the one about coral mines. Reefs as brains, more on that later. But for now, consider the sheer breadth of candidates you've got. Tool-curious theropods, hyper-intelligent oceanic cephalopods, arboreal reptiles with language like vocalizations, even mammal-like reptiles like therapsids, who nearly inherited the earth before dinosaurs stole the stage. Each of them had time, each of them had a shot, each of them might have stood at the brink of awakening. But history isn't a straight road, it's a spiral staircase. Some make it halfway up, some fall back down, and some, maybe they reached the top and chose to jump. The canyon grows darker as the sun slips behind some prehistoric horizon. You feel something in the stone beneath you, not movement, but memory. The sense that you are walking over dreams that once dreamed themselves into being. And if those dreams once built a civilization, even for a blink of an eye, they were the first. You step carefully now as if the ground itself might remember. The walls of the canyon slowly open into a wide basin filled with mist, thick and swirling, like fog that's forgotten how to leave. You pause at the edge, your breath catching, not from fear but from reverence. Something in your bones tells you, this place has seen everything. And yet it shows you nothing. No towers, no ruins, no skeletons gripping tools, just stone, just silence. But that's the trick, isn't it? If Earth had a first civilization long before humans, its ruins wouldn't look like ours. And maybe they aren't gone. Maybe they've just been digested. That's right. Welcome to the deeply unsexy truth of archaeology. Fossils are rare, and the Earth is hungry. You walk along a slope of crumbling shale, and every step reminds you how much this planet loves to clean house. Buildings fall, metals rust, bones dissolve. Even stone erodes. All of it eventually becomes part of the background radiation of time. Dust to dust, indeed. Let's make this real. Think of the Eiffel Tower. Now drop it into a tropical jungle and leave it alone for 100 years. Gone. Covered in vines rusted through, foundations cracked by roots. 1,000, buried, 10,000, you might not even know it had been there. Now try 1,000,000 years. Now try 100 million. You're starting to see the problem. Fossilization isn't kind. It's a lottery with near impossible odds. To make a fossil, something has to die in just the right place, under just the right conditions, without being scavenged, trampled, dissolved, or recycled by microbes. Most life never gets that chance. Now apply that to a civilization. What are the odds that an artificial structure would be preserved? Slim. What are the odds that we'd be able to recognize it as artificial after it's been compressed, heated, melted, reformed, and buried beneath a kilometer of rock? Even slimmer. Here's a grim historical anchor. Of all the billions of humans who have ever lived, fewer than 0.01% have left any physical remains that will persist beyond a few thousand years. That's with deliberate burial, gravestones, museums, all of it. The rest, eaten by time. So imagine an ancient civilization, not human, not even mammalian, vanishing from the record not because it was small or unremarkable, but because Earth made sure it didn't leave a mess. You step over a cracked stone that almost resembles a gear. Almost. A trick of erosion, probably. Nature loves her spirals and hexagons, but part of you hesitates. How many naturally shaped stones have we brushed off as coincidence? And it's not just erosion. The Earth has more aggressive erasers. Plate tectonics, for example. You remember high school science, right? The continents drifting like lazy rafts over molten currents. Over hundreds of millions of years, those rafts crash, split, and dive under one another in a process called subduction. Now imagine your ancient city perched proudly on some supercontinent. Along comes a fault line. Crunch. Down it goes, sliding into the mantle like leftovers into a garbage disposal. The heat down there reaches over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Your skyscraper, now it's a silicate smoothie. Even granite doesn't stand a chance. Historians still debate whether anything short of a continent-wide monument, maybe carved into a tectonically stable craton, could survive deep time. Think of something like Mount Rushmore, but 1,000 times larger. Except even that would be worn smooth eventually. Ice ages don't care about presidents. Now here's your quirky tidbit. There's a feature in South Africa called the Barberton Greenstone Belt, one of the oldest surviving pieces of Earth's crust, over 3.5 billion years old. Some have speculated, wildly, that strange, circular structures in that region could be remnants of something unnatural. Most geologists say it's just weird geology, but the shape is suspicious. Too tidy, too aligned. You crouch beside a long, horizontal groove in the rock. It stretches further than your eye can follow, straight as a laser. You tell yourself it's a glacial striation, a glacier dragging pebbles across bedrock during the last ice age. Totally normal, probably. But there's a voice in your head now that wasn't there before, and it's whispering, what if the glacier passed over something else? Something it was never meant to find. You move on. Even the materials we associate with permanence, metals, glass, plastics, aren't invincible. Iron rusts, glass fractures. Plastics, while stubborn, eventually degrade under UV light or microbial action. Sure, our landfills may last tens of thousands of years, but they're shallow, surface trash. One good floodplain event and goodbye Barbie dolls. Now imagine an ancient civilization that used biodegradable materials on purpose. Something smart, something integrated into its environment. Wouldn't that be more elegant than aluminum and concrete? Think of termites again. They build cathedral-sized structures from mud and saliva, perfectly ventilated, temperature-controlled. And when they abandon them, the jungle swallows them whole. Give it a few decades and they vanish. A pre-human civilization might have done the same, by design. A non-human intelligence could have valued impermanence. Maybe they saw endurance as arrogance. Maybe they thought decay was beautiful. Let's be honest, we humans leave traces because we're kind of messy. But an earlier, more efficient species might have lived lightly, masterfully, and in doing so left behind nothing. And here's a humbling thought. If their civilization collapsed not from war or plague but from success, a graceful exit, a planned disappearance, how would we ever know? You sit at the edge of a cliff now, staring into the mist. It could hide anything. Cities, stories, skeletons. But instead it shows you only fog. There's a stillness in this place, the kind that suggests not absence but aftermath. Like the stage after the actors have left, the lights off, the set dismantled, only the floor remains, slightly scuffed where someone once danced. And you realize, maybe we're not alone in our ambition. Maybe we're just the latest to borrow the stage. You stand now at the lip of a valley that shouldn't exist, or at least not like this. The shape is too clean, the slope too uniform, the floor too flat, as if something vast and careful once swept across it with intention. You tell yourself it's a trick of erosion, a perfect accident. And yet, as the wind pushes low through the basin like breath through a pipe, it almost sounds like a whisper. And this is where the ocean begins. Not water now, but the ghost of it. This valley was once seabed. Millions of years ago, waves curled above your head, and strange creatures glided silently over where you now stand. The sea is long gone, but you can still smell salt in the rock and feel the slow pull of tides long extinguished. So if we're chasing signs of a pre-human civilization, here's a critical pivot in the search. Look to the oceans. If someone came before us, really before us, it's very possible they built their world not on land but underwater. It makes sense when you think about it. Oceans cover about 70% of Earth's surface. They're more stable in temperature. They offer protection from surface radiation. And while humans are mostly land creatures, intelligence doesn't have to be. Modern cephalopods, octopuses, squid, cuttlefish are terrifyingly bright. Puzzle solvers, problem navigators, escape artists, and all of them live underwater. The fact that they're squishy and short-lived is a quirk of modern evolution, not a hard limit. In another timeline with a few lucky genetic shifts, who's to say they couldn't have risen higher? Now imagine if a cephalopod-like species had gone the distance, developed a society, crafted tools, harnessed resources. Maybe they didn't need fire. Maybe they didn't want combustion. What if their entire technological arc was based on biochemistry? Historians still argue whether fire is a universal prerequisite for civilization. We certainly relied on it. Smelting, cooking, sterilizing, all fire. But that's a very human-centered view. Fire is difficult to use underwater, yes, but energy is not. You can still manipulate heat, pressure, fermentation, and reaction chains without a single spark. You imagine a laboratory built of coral and shell, buried under a reef, humming with chemical luminescence. Not lab coats and beakers, just creatures blending biogels, secreting enzymes, fine-tuning bacterial colonies. Maybe their computers were alive. Maybe their communication system glowed like plankton in the dark. Sound too out there? Consider this. Some modern jellyfish bioluminesce in response to external stimuli. Some deep-sea fish use electrical pulses to sense their surroundings. These are primitive tools, biological, yes, but purposeful. Now stretch that concept forward a few 100 million years. And then ask yourself, what happens to underwater cities after 1 million years? Short answer, they vanish. Salt water is relentless. It corrodes, collapses, buries. Submarine landslides can erase miles of seafloor in seconds. Hydrothermal vents form mineral towers that crumble and rebuild in decades. Even tectonic rifts yawning beneath the ocean quietly consume miles of crust like the earth eating its own skin. And if a civilization lived in the shallows, say goodbye to that too. Coastal shelves are constantly shifting, rising, falling, crumbling under pressure. The sea isn't a peaceful museum. It's an eraser on fast forward. There's also the question of exploration. Humans have mapped the surfaces of Mars and the Moon in greater detail than our own ocean floors. That's not a metaphor. That's a budgetary fact. The vast majority of Earth's underwater terrain remains unseen, unscanned, unstudied. So even if something were down there, the odds of us stumbling across it, intentionally or otherwise, are minuscule. Here's your curious historical tidbit. In 1968, divers off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas found a series of large, flat stones forming what looked like a man-made road or wall, now known as the Bimini Road. Some believe it's a natural formation. Others call it evidence of a sunken city. Mainstream science says coastal beach rock fractured naturally. Fringe theorists say Atlantis. The truth, as always, probably somewhere murky in the middle. You descend now into the valley's basin, where the ground crunches underfoot with the sound of ancient shells. The sediment here is pale and fine, like powdered bone. You run your fingers through it and uncover a flat shard, smooth on one side, pitted on the other, curved just slightly, like part of a bowl. You tell yourself it's a fossil, a shell, of course it is. But still, you keep it in your hand longer than you should. Now imagine this, an underwater civilization that wasn't just smart but slow, not in mind but in motion. A society that developed across tens of millions of years, no rush to industrialize, no need for expansion. Their cities might have been more like gardens, cultivated in the folds of the seafloor, structures that grew rather than were built, ecosystems tuned like instruments. Maybe they didn't even die out. Maybe they transformed or simply left. Remember your fringe bonus of the night. Some modern deep-sea squid species show migration patterns that we can't fully explain. Whole generations vanish into trenches for breeding, places we've never seen, can't reach, and have no clear maps of. Historians still debate whether these behaviors are purely instinctual or a biological memory of something older. You reach a large basin now, almost bowl-shaped, ringed by concentric ridges. It looks suspiciously deliberate, the kind of place you could imagine once cradled a dome, or a massive shell, or something that pulsed with warm light long before the first trilobites squirmed across a seabed. The mist begins to lift just a little, and for a second, only a second, you swear you see patterns in the ridges, swirling spirals, woven channels, like a forgotten language etched into the landscape. But then the wind shifts, the mist returns, and all of it, everything, is swallowed. Gone. You sit at the basin's edge, letting the silence sink back in. The ocean is gone, but the sea remembers. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers them. You move slowly now, tracing a narrow path that curls upward from the basin like the spiral of a seashell. As you climb, the sediment under your feet becomes gritty, shifting from soft seabed powder to pebbled stone, sharp, fractured, and oddly scattered. It's as though something exploded here long ago, and the land has been trying to forget ever since. But you're not forgetting. You're remembering, or at least, imagining how to remember something that maybe never wanted to be found. Because here's a question that keeps sneaking up behind you. What if the first toolmaker on Earth didn't have hands? We humans tend to equate intelligence with dexterity. Thumbs, grip strength, the ability to hold a stick and poke something until it either becomes a solution or stops being a problem. But intelligence doesn't require opposable thumbs. It requires adaptability, pattern recognition, a desire to manipulate the environment, no matter the method. You crouch beside a long, thin groove in the rock. It's too straight, too clean. You run your finger along it, then brush away some dust. Another groove intersecting the first. They form a right angle. Your pulse stirs. A corner. Corners don't happen often in nature. Probably a cracked rock slab, right? Probably. But now you're thinking in terms of alternative toolmaking. Take a moment to consider the octopus again. It doesn't have hands, doesn't even have bones, yet it manipulates shells, unscrews jars, rearranges stones to build temporary shelters. Some have even been observed carrying coconut shells to use as portable armor. That's not instinct, that's planning. Now evolve that behavior across hundreds of generations. What do you get? Maybe tools made of shell instead of metal, bone, chitin, even hardened resins, biological plastics that biodegrade so perfectly we'd never know they existed. Historians still argue whether the fossil record shows any sign of repetitive tool use outside of hominins. Some researchers point to wear marks on fossilized bones or shells that suggest shaping, sharpening, or scraping. But the context is missing. It's like finding a USB cable in a desert and having no idea what a computer is. We might be surrounded by artifacts and not even recognize them. You remember that time someone found a naturally shaped rock in Africa that vaguely resembles a human face, dating back 2.5 million years. It's called the Makapansket pebble, and it's believed that an early hominin may have picked it up and carried it purely because it looked like something familiar. No carving, no tool marks, just aesthetic curiosity, which may very well be the first art. Now imagine a species that didn't shape its tools so much as select them. The world is full of naturally useful objects: sharpened sticks, flat stones, shell scoops, hardened coral. What if the first civilization didn't invent tools, just curated them? That's hard to trace in the fossil record. A stick used for a generation won't fossilize. A carved bone left in a wet cave gets eaten by bacteria. Even something as advanced as obsidian knives, if crafted without distinguishing marks, could be dismissed as geological debris. You're beginning to see the problem. Or maybe the beauty. You pass under an arching rock formation that resembles the ribcage of something long dead. It creaks slightly in the wind. You duck under, and suddenly the landscape opens into a field of fractured slate, scattered in tall, thin slabs like monoliths. Each leans slightly, all in the same direction. You walk among them like a pilgrim. Could these have been placed? Could they have been arranged? You tell yourself it's just the wind, just erosion, maybe a tectonic tilt. But the pattern sticks in your head, too rhythmic, too considerate. Let's get quirky for a second. Modern crows have been observed shaping leaves into hooks to extract insects from crevices. That's advanced cognition. Even better, they teach each other how to do it. That's culture, all without fingers. So why are we so stuck on hands? The truth is, the form doesn't matter. What matters is intention. Whether the being in question is trying to alter its world, and whether it passes that knowledge on. Imagine a civilization based on fluid architecture, structures that shift with the tide, adjust with temperature, regenerate over time. What if the tools themselves were semi-alive, grown rather than forged? Tool marks in that case wouldn't be chisel cuts. They'd be genetic tweaks, hormonal stains, structures not carved into stone but encoded into a host species' shell. And here's your fringe treat of the night. In 1977, a strange structure was detected on the ocean floor near the Bahamas, about 20 meters wide, shaped like a perfect circle, ringed by regularly spaced spokes. Theories ranged from sunken saucers to natural formations caused by seafloor vents. Officially, a curious geomorphic feature. Unofficially, a whisper, a maybe. Historians still debate whether certain recurring ocean patterns, spoke wheels, concentric rings, spiral mounds, are truly geological. Some say yes. Others point out that similar patterns show up in modern intelligent behavior, like crop circles, yes, but also termite mounds and fish mating nests. Fish mating nests. That's right. The pufferfish, of all things, creates intricate geometric sand patterns up to 6 feet across to attract mates. It doesn't use tools, just its fins and creativity. If you saw one fossilized, would you think it was art, or just a weird current? You sit now in the center of this slate field, surrounded by leaning stones. You touch one. It's warm from the sun, but there's a chill beneath it. An echo. Maybe the memory of something lifted, turned, and placed. And suddenly, you wonder, what if our obsession with tools is actually a limitation? What if the first civilization on Earth didn't shape the world with hammers and fire, but with behavior, selection, genetics, chemistry? What if their tools weren't left behind because they were never meant to last? What if they were only ever meant to work once? You move deeper into the slate field, your footsteps soft against the crumbling stone. The air smells faintly metallic now, like ozone after a storm, or maybe just your brain trying to make sense of ancient minerals waking in the morning sun. There's a strange stillness here, like the land itself is holding its breath, waiting to see if you notice something it forgot how to explain. And then a wild thought lands, quiet but undeniable. What if the first civilization never used fire at all? You stop walking. It's such a basic assumption, right? That all intelligent life follows the same steps we did. Spark a flame, roast a root, melt a rock, invent YouTube. But what if those steps aren't the only way? What if they're just ours? You crouch near a flat stone etched with faint, meandering lines, veins of quartz running through dark granite. To your brain, it looks a bit like a circuit board. You know it's just mineral patterning. Probably. But now you're asking different questions. Dangerous questions. Sleepy, speculative, delicious questions. Like, is fire essential to civilization? Or just essential to our civilization? Let's break it down. Humans used fire for warmth, cooking, defense, metallurgy, and eventually industry. It's our hammer, our Swiss Army knife, our original technology. But fire is messy, dangerous, and honestly, it's pretty primitive when you zoom out. What if someone else got clever enough to skip it entirely? You imagine a being with no desire to burn things. Maybe it lives underwater, or in a high-oxygen atmosphere where flame is a liability, or maybe it finds combustion gross, too destructive, too irreversible. So instead, it learns to engineer biologically. Why smelt ore when you can grow a shell that's harder than steel? Why build a furnace when you can cultivate bacteria that excrete conductive polymers? Why light a fire when you can master enzymatic reaction, chemistry done with the delicacy of a spider spinning silk? Historians still argue whether biochemical technology would count as advanced in the traditional sense. We love our shiny things, our engines, our noise. But what if the first civilization wasn't about brute force? What if it was about quiet precision? Let's ground this in something real. The bombardier beetle, a tiny creature that defends itself by mixing chemicals inside its body and shooting a boiling spray at attackers. It's got a natural combustion chamber, self-regulating valves, internal chemistry labs, and it does all of that without ever lighting a match. Now scale that up. You're picturing it, aren't you? A species that learns to harvest, mix, and refine chemistry not with heat, but with enzymes, pressure, and timing. No furnaces, no smoke, just quiet reactions that happen deep inside engineered organisms. Controlled, reproducible, passed down like recipes, not machines, methods. Maybe they didn't build factories. Maybe they bred them, living structures, organic systems. Things that self-replicated, healed, and biodegraded on schedule. Tools grown in fields. Homes that walked. Vessels that swam. And here, where your brain really starts to drift. If their technology was fully integrated with biology, maybe it left no trace at all. Maybe the only fossils were bones and shells, because the rest simply decomposed exactly as it was designed to. You climb now onto a broad, sun-warmed shelf of stone, and you see something peculiar. A circular depression, rimmed with smooth ridges about 6 feet across. It looks like an ancient cauldron, or a nest, or maybe a chamber. It's dry now, but the sediment in its center glitters with traces of crystal, microscopic, brittle, almost ash-like. You kneel and sift your fingers through it. Nothing concrete, just a tingling idea. Reaction happened here. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Scientists have discovered bacteria that can literally breathe metals using iron or manganese instead of oxygen. In a sense, they rust their environment as part of their metabolism. That's not science fiction. That's a real-life alien process happening in Earth's soil right now. So imagine a civilization that didn't invent combustion, just borrowed reactions already happening in nature, fine-tuned them, manipulated them with living cells. What would they build? Maybe nothing we'd recognize. Historians still debate whether the oldest known metal objects, like the 5,000-year-old copper all found in Israel, represent the beginning of metallurgy or just a fragment of something older lost. A first time, a forgotten time, maybe not even our time. And if there was someone else before us working without fire, we might never detect them because we're looking for burned things, and they were looking for balance. You wander now along the edge of a cliff where the rock turns redder, iron-rich, oxidized in some forgotten millennia. Below, in a narrow ravine, glints of strange color reflect the sun. Not gold, not metal, just an iridescence, like beetle wing or butterfly scale, but fossilized into stone. You wonder if it's just mineral sheen. Then you wonder if it's residue, a trace of a process, not fire but fermentation, or bonding, or catalysis. What if their power didn't come from smoke, but from silence? And that brings you to your last delicious idea of the night. Maybe the first civilization wasn't loud. Maybe it didn't scream itself into history with smog and steel. Maybe it whispered, moved softly, left no soot behind. And when it was done, it didn't fall. It simply dissolved. You stand at the edge of a wind-blasted rise now, staring up at a jagged peak that juts from the horizon like a tooth too stubborn to be ground down. Its surface is scarred, cracked, but somehow still defiant, like it's holding onto something. A secret maybe, or a memory. You begin the climb. Each step grinds ancient dust beneath your feet, and the air thins as you rise, carrying with it the cold hush of altitude and time. Your muscles ache, not from exertion, but from the weight of wondering. Because this mountain, like everything else tonight, might not be what it seems. What if it's not just a mountain? What if, long before it wore its erosion like armor, this place was something else entirely? A structure, a reactor, a monument, a tower grown from the bones of the earth. You climb higher, past bands of quartz veining through the rock like frozen lightning. Every so often, the path crosses oddly smooth surfaces, too smooth, planar, consistent in angle, not rough like the chaotic results of nature's hammer, but uniform, machine flat. And again, the question slips in. How much can erosion hide? Let's pause for a truth bomb. Earth is exceptionally good at wiping the slate clean. If you want something to disappear, just leave it out in the open. Rain, wind, freeze-thaw, vegetation. These are not passive processes. They are relentless. Over tens of thousands of years, they erase edges. Over millions, they erase entire histories. Historians still argue whether the Sphinx in Egypt shows signs of water erosion far older than traditional dating allows. Some geologists claim the vertical weathering patterns suggest extreme antiquity, possibly pre-dynastic. Others say that's nonsense. And yet, the rock continues to drip and peel in ways we can't quite explain. Now zoom that out. What if you took a structure 10 times older and left it exposed for 10,000 times longer? Would you still recognize it? You crest a ridge and arrive at a ledge, a plateau nestled beneath the mountain's fractured peak. Here, the wind slows, the sun angles low, and the view opens wide across a rolling landscape that once, you're certain, looked very different. Because here, another thought that curls like smoke in your mind. What if this mountain was built? Not in the way we build things, not with cranes and concrete, but guided into form, shaped by a mind that worked in continental scales and geologic patience. A mind that knew how to whisper to magma, how to bend sedimentary layers like origami. A mind that treated geology like clay. The mountain itself may have been the machine, or the message. And that leads you to a concept that sounds ridiculous until it doesn't: geoengineering as architecture. The idea that you could build not cities but landscapes, not monuments that sit on the earth but ones made of it. Imagine redirecting lava flows to shape walls, encouraging limestone buildup in perfect symmetry, using seismic tremors to etch patterns into cliffs. Over millennia, what starts as subtle nudges could become vast expressions of intent. Now imagine the erosion. The wind, the water, the folding of continents. After 100 million years, all you'd have left is a mountain, and no one would ever suspect. You run your hand along the stone at your feet. It's warm in the sun, pocked with time. But beneath the grime, you notice a seam, a shallow channel. It curves slightly, too deliberately. You follow it. It becomes a spiral embedded in the rock, half swallowed by lichen and time, but still visible, still whispering. You laugh softly, because of course it's a coincidence, a fracture, a fault line, a joke played by pressure and chaos. Probably. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In Bolivia, there's a site called Sajama Lines, massive, straight geoglyphs etched into the desert soil, stretching for miles. Created by ancient indigenous people, their purpose is still debated. Some say paths, others say ceremonial, but they're so long, so straight, so persistent that satellites pick them up better than the human eye. What if a pre-human civilization left something similar, but built into the bedrock? What if, instead of soil, they carved messages into tectonically stable regions, hoping someone, some species, might one day evolve enough to ask the right questions? Historians still debate whether true communication across deep time is even possible, not because the math is hard, but because the medium decays. Stone erodes, metal rusts, language shifts, even memory, encoded in DNA or artifact, warps over time like a vinyl record left too close to a fire. And yet, here you are, standing atop what might be a message disguised as a mountain. It doesn't blink, doesn't glow, doesn't announce itself. But it endures. You imagine what it might have been: a power hub, an observatory, a transmitter, or something simpler, a place to gather, a temple, a grave. Maybe their dead are buried here, if they even died at all. You lie back against the warm stone and look up at the sky. It's changed so much over the eons. Different constellations, a faster spinning Earth, moons slightly closer, comets that once lit this sky no longer visit. But maybe once, long ago, someone stood here looking up too. Maybe they built this peak to face a now vanished star. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't meant to last forever. Just long enough for you to wonder. You descend slowly from the mountain. the sky deepening with that smoky blue that only appears when the day is almost done but not quite ready to give up. Your hands trail along the rock walls as you walk, each ridge and groove like the spine of an ancient book. You're not sure if the mountain changed you, or if you simply started listening more closely. Because now, everything feels suspicious. Every oddly shaped stone, every unexpected groove, every formation that looks just a little too intentional. You're seeing patterns. And while some part of your brain tries to remind you that humans are designed to see faces in clouds and meaning in noise, another part is leaning closer and whispering, "What if this time you're right?" And that brings you here, to a place geologists dread and archaeologists argue about. Welcome to the gallery of the out-of-place artifact. You reach the bottom of the slope and enter a narrow ravine, its walls peppered with embedded stones and fossilized fragments. At first glance, it's just rubble, natural, chaotic. But then you spot it, something smooth, spherical, and gleaming faintly in the fading light. You brush away the sediment. It's heavy, round, metallic, perfectly symmetrical, and yet it's been buried here for how long? You found your first part, an out-of-place artifact, the kind of thing that shows up just often enough to cause existential indigestion. Here's a real one. In the 1880s, a set of grooved metallic spheres were discovered in Oudtshoorn, South Africa, in Precambrian strata over 2.8 billion years old. Officially, they're called Klerksdorp spheres. Some have ridges, others appear hollow. Geologists say they're natural concretions formed by volcanic ash deposits under intense pressure. Fringe thinkers say, maybe not. You turn the sphere in your hands. It's cool to the touch with a faint seam running around its equator. Not a crack, more like a line of assembly. You hold it to your ear as if expecting it to hum. It doesn't, but still. Historians still argue whether most parts are hoaxes, misidentifications, or just embarrassing anomalies swept under the intellectual rug. After all, science moves forward by building consensus, not chasing ghosts. But ghosts don't care about consensus. And these artifacts, real or not, refuse to die quietly. You walk on. In your mind, the list of strange discoveries builds. The London hammer, supposedly embedded in Ordovician rock over 400 million years old. The Antikythera mechanism, a Greek artifact thousands of years ahead of its known technology. The Baghdad battery, the Nazca lines, fossilized footprints next to those of dinosaurs. Now most of these have reasonable explanations. Many are dated incorrectly, others are misunderstood, some are flat-out fakes, but the sheer volume of them suggests something deeper than fraud. It suggests longing, a human ache to understand where we really come from, because deep down we know the record is incomplete, and if the gaps are big enough, what might have slipped through? You reach a clearing where rust-colored stone shelves step down like the seats of an amphitheater. They face a shallow wall, blackened with time, yet oddly clean, as if something had once been scrubbed from its surface. You approach slowly. At the center of the wall, there's a mark, barely visible now. A square, indented slightly about the size of a small window. You trace its edges, too regular to be natural, too damaged to be definitive. Was something removed, cut out, or installed? And here comes tonight's speculative dive. What if some parts aren't misidentified at all? What if they're remnants, tiny survivals of a long-gone civilization that didn't leave roads or walls, but fragments? Not a statue, a circuit, not a spear, a sensor. What if we found parts of their world, but don't know how to name them? You sit now at the lowest tier of stone, the air around you oddly still. The light dims. Your hand brushes another object, flat, smooth, thin like a sliver of obsidian. You lift it, and for a moment it catches the light like a lens. Could be a broken rock, probably is. Or it's a screen long dead, a solar panel fossilized, a shard of memory. And then there's this. Every year, amateur fossil hunters and miners dig up strange things that don't quite fit. Stones shaped like gears, patterns etched in fossil beds, layers of coal pierced by metal rods. Some are debunked, others vanish quietly. A few linger on fringe websites like stubborn, unsolved riddles. Historians still debate whether some of these objects have been purposefully forgotten, shelved, archived, buried not by time but by discomfort. After all, nothing rattles a discipline like the possibility that its foundational timeline is wrong. You let your gaze drift back to the blackened wall. It's empty now, but you can't shake the feeling that it once displayed something. Not a painting, a symbol, a signal. Maybe it wasn't meant for us, or maybe it was. Maybe they knew somehow that something would rise after them, something curious, soft-skinned, prone to wander, to dig, to ask. Maybe we were expected, and maybe we were left behind just enough. You sit at the base of that darkened wall until the sun dips just enough to turn the stone golden, then copper, then a blue that feels like memory. The shadows lengthen, the breeze quiets, and still, no answers. Just you, the quiet, and a half-buried shard that may or may not be a message. You brush it off again, still holding onto the hope that it might flicker, blink, or hum. Some little nod from deep time saying, yes, we were here. But it doesn't. It just lies there inert like the rest of the world. Still, you tuck it gently into your satchel as if collecting possibilities. Because here's the thought chewing away at you now. Maybe we're not missing one or two artifacts. Maybe we're missing everything. You've reached the part of the journey where the idea blooms into something bigger, something unsettling and oddly beautiful. What if Earth itself is a technological palimpsest? A palimpsest, in case you're rubbing sleep from your brain right now, is an old manuscript that's been written on, then scraped clean, then reused. Faint traces of the original text sometimes remain, just enough to hint that something came before. Layers of meaning, overwritten by newer hands. Now imagine Earth as a manuscript, rewritten over and over again. Ice ages, floods, volcanic cataclysms, meteor strikes, civilizations rising, falling, and vanishing into the sediment like ink into vellum. You lean back against the wall and close your eyes. What if beneath every continent, every city, every quiet field, there's another story half erased? You know what makes this idea so eerie? It doesn't require a conspiracy. No cover-up, no aliens, just time, just entropy, just Earth being exceptionally good at recycling. Historians still argue whether some ancient cities, like those found in Turkey's during Kuyu, an underground labyrinth housing tens of thousands, are anomalies or simply forgotten adaptations. But the deeper we dig, the stranger things get. And if we dig deep enough, maybe we're not the first ones to carve meaning into stone. You walk now into a dry wash where slabs of rock lie half-toppled and jagged. To your left, one of them bears a long, flat surface with narrow ridges running parallel across it. Could be a glacial scrape, could be ancient machinery. You run your fingers along the grooves. And here comes tonight's hypothesis that won't let you go. Maybe we're walking across a reused world. Let's get nerdy for a second. In data science, there's a concept called data layering, when one set of data is superimposed on another, and unless you know what you're looking for, the previous layer gets lost in the noise. Same goes for paint on a wall. Same goes for roads built over older roads. Now apply that to planetary history. You're living on a data set that's been scrubbed and repopulated over and over again. And our civilization, as bold and bright and clever as it thinks it is, may just be the newest scribble in the corner. This isn't paranoia. It's a possibility, a geological reality. Even modern infrastructure, tunnels, buildings, subways, leaves minimal trace unless preserved intentionally or encased accidentally. And if the civilizations that came before used non-permanent materials or even intentionally deconstructed themselves, forget it. They'd be gone like dew off the morning grass. You reach a small overhang now, ducking beneath it into a space that feels different. The air here doesn't move. The stone walls curve inward unnaturally, not like a cave, more like an interior. It's just a hollow in the rock, probably formed by wind and freeze cycles. But still, your brain pings the shape as familiar, like the remains of a dome, or a chamber, or a husk of something that used to hum with purpose. You kneel and press your ear to the floor. You don't expect to hear anything, but you do anyway. Not a sound, just a tone, a low, impossible vibration in your bones. It's probably nothing. Or maybe it's the leftover tuning fork of a civilization that once understood resonance in ways we still can't explain. And here's your fringe flavor of the night. Some theorists believe the Great Pyramid of Giza isn't just a tomb, but a resonant machine, designed to amplify or manipulate frequencies using geometry, water, and the Earth's own vibrations. Mainstream Egyptologists, of course, roll their eyes, but the acoustics are odd, the materials are precise, and the location is astronomically significant. What if that's not an exception? What if it's a hint, a surviving fragment from a deeper layer, a copy of a copy of a copy? Historians still debate whether ancient cultures developed their architecture independently or inherited certain geometries from forgotten predecessors. Spiral motifs, golden ratios, the consistent use of sacred numbers in structures continents apart. Coincidence, cultural osmosis, or echoes. You lean back against the stone wall and close your eyes. The whole world feels like a room that was once filled with music, loud, clear, sophisticated, and now holds only echoes. But the shape of that music remains, in the curves of a canyon, in the alignment of a mountain, in the invisible grid that lies just beneath the cities we build. Earth isn't empty, it's overwritten. And if that's true, then somewhere beneath our feet, under all the dirt and time, the first draft still waits. The silence that surrounds you now isn't just quiet, it's reverent, as if the earth itself has taken a deep breath, waiting to see whether you'll keep asking, or whether you'll simply lie down among the stones and accept the weight of unknowing. You choose to stay a little longer in this hollow, not just to rest your legs, but to let your mind wander deeper. Because if Earth is a palimpsest, rewritten over and over, then some things, just a few, might survive the editing. Not buildings, not bones, but symbols. And what is a symbol really? A shape, a pattern, a container for meaning. Something that can travel across time as long as something or someone still knows how to read it. So you turn now to the question that has been hovering quietly in the corners of your journey like a shadow in your peripheral vision. What if the first civilization left no words, but still left language? You walk again, slowly, mindfully. The ground beneath your feet is smooth now, like worn clay. Here and there, you notice indentations, grooves, spirals, pairs of parallel lines. Nothing dramatic, nothing you'd point to and call an alphabet, but you can't help but feel like they're repeating. Not identical, but familiar, recurring. And something inside you stirs, recognition without context. Symbols don't need translation. They operate on a different level, shapes that mean something without needing a dictionary. The spiral, the circle, the double helix. You see these not just in art but in life, in nature, in your own biology. Historians still argue whether symbolic thinking predates written language. Some say it began with cave paintings. Others push it further back, to decorated bones, ritual burials, arranged stones. The line between art and language blurs, dissolves. You pass a wall of sedimentary rock and your hand brushes over a smooth spiral pressed deep into the stone. Not a fossil, not quite. Just a curl, deliberate, like something pressed into wet clay once and left to harden in time. You lean closer. There's another beside it, then 3, then 6. A pattern, a sentence maybe, but written in a language that doesn't use words, doesn't use grammar, just shapes that feel like something you used to know. And now your brain is really running. Because if the first civilization was pre-verbal, if it communicated through symbolism, geometry, music, or frequency, then our current tools for deciphering it are hilariously unqualified. We're digging for pottery when we should be listening for tone. We're carbon dating soil while walking over forgotten syntax. What if the grooves in cave walls weren't accidental? What if the scratch marks in fossil beds aren't from claws, but from hands or fins or tentacles with purpose? You take a deep breath and remember your quirky fact of the night. In 1994, the Chauvet Cave in France was discovered, filled with prehistoric paintings over 30,000 years old. The images are so advanced, so skilled, they rewrote what archaeologists thought was possible for early humans. Shading, motion blur, even storytelling, and no one knows why. There are no words in Chauvet, just intention, just awe. So now imagine that kind of symbolic expression millions of years earlier, by something not human, something with its own way of recording meaning, not with letters but with patterns, curves, repetition. Maybe it wasn't even visual. Maybe it was auditory. Maybe the real language of the first civilization was music, not the kind you hum, but environmental soundscapes, patterns of vibration encoded into caves, into water, into the magnetic lines of the planet itself. Sound as signal, resonance as memory. Here, where it gets fringe and irresistible, some researchers have proposed that ancient megalithic sites, like Stonehenge or Göbekli Tepe, were built not just for rituals but for acoustic effects. The stones ring at specific frequencies, chambers hum, echoes bounce in ways that feel engineered. Historians still debate whether this was intentional or coincidental. But if even a handful were built with sound in mind, it raises the possibility that this is a very old idea, passed down from a source we no longer remember. You follow a path now that narrows into a winding gorge. The stone walls are close on both sides, and every sound you make bounces, twice, then 3 times, then disappears. You whistle softly. The echo returns in a way that shouldn't be possible. 1 note, then a harmonic. It's probably just a quirk of the acoustics, probably. But what if this gorge wasn't a path, but a sentence, a recorded idea, a tone poem? You are, quite literally, walking through a message, and your presence activates it. No plug, no password, just proximity. You place your hand on the stone and hum. A shiver climbs your spine. The wall hums back. And now the whole idea settles in. Maybe we've been looking for the wrong kind of language. We expect civilization to leave behind books, tablets, inscriptions. But the first civilization might have left something far more subtle, far more durable. Not paper, not sound, but form. Patterns in coral reefs, symmetries in mountain ranges, ratios encoded in the spacing of trees, all of it a kind of communication we've forgotten how to read. You reach the end of the gorge and find yourself facing a wall of polished black stone. There are no markings, no carvings, just a perfect arc, smooth and cold and whispering nothing at all. Or maybe everything. And for the first time tonight, the question shifts. Not what if they were here, but what if they still are? You stand before the smooth black wall, your hand resting against its cool surface, heart steady but mind racing. This isn't stone that was left behind. This is stone that waited. Something about it feels less like an artifact and more like an interface, or an invitation. But the only password it seems to recognize is silence. And that's fine. Silence is the perfect medium for what's about to unfold in your imagination. You've gone through questions of tools, of fire, of language, but now you need to follow that speculative thread just a little further. Because if the first civilization on Earth wasn't human, and if it didn't use stone or metal or fire, then perhaps it used something more radical. What if they didn't adapt to their world? What if they rewrote it? You walk again slowly along the edge of a shallow pool where thin rivulets trace delicate patterns through mud and ash. They remind you of circuits, or veins, or something between. Because now you're not thinking about tools or symbols. You're thinking about biology, about DNA, about life itself as the ultimate technology. You're thinking, what if the first civilization were bioengineers? And not like us, dabbling with CRISPR and genetically modified corn. No, you're imagining a civilization whose primary interface with reality wasn't code or concrete, but cells. Something that didn't build machines but grew them. Something that saw flesh and fungus and plankton as the raw material of innovation. You crouch by the pool and study a series of shallow ridges in the clay, raised in repeating arcs like fingerprints. They're probably just ripple marks from water flow. Probably. But they look arranged, patterned, like memory grown into mud. Here's your historical reference point. Scientists now believe that ancient humans may have domesticated plants and animals far earlier than previously thought, not just through breeding, but through landscape manipulation, purposeful planting, ecosystem nudging, shaping forests to provide food centuries later. Now imagine that kind of thinking, supercharged. Imagine a species that doesn't just live in nature but edits it. That doesn't invent the wheel because it doesn't need one. It reprograms a caterpillar to carry its cargo. It grows fungal networks to form walkways. It builds living machines, self-healing, semi-conscious, shaped from the DNA of 1,000 borrowed species. And then imagine what that would leave behind after extinction. Not rust, not crumbling towers, but evolved organisms with no wild ancestor, trees that grow in perfectly repeating intervals, flowers that bloom in spiral codes, insects that seem to serve no ecological purpose except to mirror the flight pattern of a long-dead drone. Historians still argue whether the Cambrian explosion, that sudden, dazzling burst of new life forms 540 million years ago, was simply evolution accelerating, or something stranger, a natural miracle, or a reset button pushed by hands we never knew existed. And here's your fringe flavor of the night. In the fossil record, there are organisms from that period, like Anomalocaris, that don't seem to fit into any known lineage. They show up, they dominate, they vanish. No ancestors, no descendants, just a strange, efficient blip in life's resume, like software that was installed, tested, and deleted. You walk now through a clearing of strange trees, if you can call them that. Their trunks are soft, almost sponge-like. Their bark peels not in flakes but in long, ribbon-like strips, The leaves curl into Fibonacci spirals so exact, you could measure them with a caliper. You reach out and touch one. The trunk gives slightly, warm, moist. You recoil gently, not in fear but in wonder. What if it's not a tree? What if it's the descendant of a living structure? A building that once had nervous tissue, reflexes, hormone-like signaling pathways. Something designed long ago to hold a shape and respond to stimulus. And now, with its purpose lost to time, it simply grows upward, unthinking, like a poem missing its final stanza. Maybe we're not walking through forests at all. Maybe we're walking through graveyards of forgotten design. And maybe that's why we haven't found ruins or monuments from this lost civilization, because the ruins are alive. They've evolved past recognition, or been folded back into the biosphere with such care that we mistake them for wilderness. You sit now beneath the spiral-leafed tree and try to imagine their world. Not metal and noise, but green and slow. A civilization that communicated through pheromones, through pollen, through electromagnetic pulses in soil and water. Information passed not through books or hard drives, but through genetic encoding. Picture this, a library of plants, each species holding a part of the message. A garden grown not for beauty or food, but for memory. And when tended in the correct sequence, blooming in precise rhythms, it tells a story. A biological hard drive, a photosynthetic record. One you could only read if you knew how to listen to life. You remember that some modern trees, like bristlecone pines, can live for over 5,000 years. And some fungi, like the massive armillaria networks in Oregon, may be tens of thousands of years old, connected underground across acres. Silent, persistent, intelligent in ways we barely understand. Historians still debate whether cognition requires a central brain. But if a mushroom can sense, adapt, and respond across a forest, what is that, if not a kind of distributed awareness? What if the first civilization didn't have cities, because it was a city, not separate from nature, but integrated into it so fully that even its collapse looked like an ecosystem blooming? You look back at the pool, at the patterned clay, at the trees still humming gently in the breeze. And for a moment, the world feels less like a place you live in, and more like a skin you've only just learned to feel. You move gently now, as if the ground beneath you might wake up. Every leaf seems to lean toward you just slightly. Every root hesitates before letting you pass. The idea has fully rooted itself in your mind now. The first civilization may not have built its world from stone or metal, but from biology. And if that's true, maybe it never stopped growing. You pass through a grove of tall structures that look like trees but don't move like them. They quiver at your approach, not from wind, but from some inner tension. Their surfaces are textured, not barked, not smooth, almost scaled. You run your hand across one. It's warm again and moist, not wet, just awake. You don't say anything. You're not sure it would understand, and worse, you're not sure it wouldn't. Because now we've arrived at one of the most radical, oddly plausible, and hypnotically speculative ideas in this journey. What if the first civilization wasn't built at all, but grown? Or more precisely, what if it was the structure? Forget cities of stone. Picture cities of coral, not carved, not constructed, but secreted, layered, pulsing with a slow intelligence that spanned generations. Cities that reproduced, evolved, even competed with each other, not through war, but through adaptation. Which brings us to tonight's most dreamlike theory, the conscious coral hypothesis. It's not mainstream, not by a long shot, but it pops up in the corners of speculative biology and fringe ecology, usually whispered by people who stare at tide pools too long. The idea is this. Coral reefs, like fungal networks and termite colonies, operate as superorganisms. Individual coral polyps are simple, barely more than mouths with tentacles. But together, they form intricate architectures, manage nutrient flows, self-regulate, and repair damage. They have memory, response systems, communication pathways. Now push that concept to its wildest edge. What if, in the deep past, one or more reefs crossed a cognitive threshold? Not suddenly, not like flipping a switch, but over millions of years, what began as reflex evolved into recognition. What began as stimulus response became pattern awareness. Not a brain, but something that functioned like one. A reef mind. A distributed, slow-thinking intelligence spread across hundreds of kilometers of living architecture. No hierarchy, no ego, just intelligence, collective and quiet. Historians still argue whether intelligence even has to be fast. We think quickly, yes, but that's a survival trick, a biological shortcut. It doesn't mean slow thoughts are less real, only that they happen at a pace we're not built to notice. Maybe that's why we missed them. They weren't loud, they weren't quick. They were steady. You duck beneath a low-hanging frond, and suddenly the path opens into a glade of spiraling structures that look disturbingly familiar. Coils, shells, arches, nothing artificial, but nothing wild either. It hits you then, the patterns. The Fibonacci spiral repeated in nautilus shells, sunflower heads, galaxies. The golden ratio. These aren't human discoveries. We simply named them. They've been here longer than we have. Maybe longer than bones. Maybe longer than language. And maybe, just maybe, someone else discovered them first. Not with math, not with chalkboards, but with life itself. Here's your quirky fact of the night. Coral polyps can communicate via chemical signaling. Some scientists believe reefs respond to stress in coordinated ways, sending signals across vast stretches. Certain species will even coordinate spawning globally on the same night, despite being separated by oceans. That's not chaos, that's communication. So here's the real speculative twist. What if ancient coral civilizations didn't just grow, they intended their growth? What if the shapes we see as beautiful accidents were in fact syntax? What if the reef itself was the message? Historians still debate whether structures like Yonaguni, an underwater formation near Japan, are natural or man-made. The steps, the flat surfaces, the sharp angles, they look architectural. But dive deeper and you find coral intertwined with the stone, not as a parasite, as a participant. What if Yonaguni isn't a ruin? What if it's a fossilized thought? You stand in the glade, eyes scanning the curves around you. They don't feel placed, they feel emerged, as if something tried to tell a story through shape, a language of waves, spirals, branching fractals. And now it lies here, forgotten by time but not by the soil. And here's the humbling part. What if we are not descended from them, but simply came after them? They rose, they spread, they became the reefs and the forests and the oceans. And when they were done, they didn't leave behind statues or machines. They left behind ecosystems. The cities we swim past while snorkeling. The coastlines we defend with seawalls, the tidal zones we think of as passive, but which might be residues of intelligence. Maybe their greatest achievement wasn't the conquest of nature, but the sublimation into it. You step closer to one of the spiral growths and realize the surface is covered in pits, regularly spaced, uniform in size, not decay, not erosion, more like nodes, input, output. It doesn't speak, but then maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it already said what it needed to say, in spiral, in shimmer, in silence. And now it watches, patient, to see if anyone will listen back. You linger in the glade of spirals, watching the sky slip into dusk, the shadows curling longer between the shapes that now feel less like natural formations and more like a kind of punctuation. Sentences that ended a long time ago, or maybe never ended at all. Because if you tilt your head just right and squint into the layers of moss and mineral, the spirals seem to ripple, not literally, but in memory, like echoes still trying to reach the surface. But tonight's journey is about to shift again. Because what if everything you've explored so far, the trees, the oceans, the coral mines, didn't actually begin here? What if Earth's first civilization wasn't from Earth at all? You hear it before you think it, that little hum of doubt, the part of your brain that says, oh no, not this, not aliens. But hold on, breathe. This isn't about flying saucers or crop circles. This is about possibility, naturalized speculation, a thought experiment wrapped in a warm, sleepy robe. What if the first intelligence that took root here was planted? You begin walking again, the ground firmer now, shifting from spongy glade to dry highland. The terrain looks volcanic, ancient lava flows cooled into black glass. The path glitters with obsidian shards, catching the last of the twilight like spilled stars. Here's the idea, panspermia, a real scientific theory. It suggests that life, or at least its building blocks, might not have originated on Earth. Maybe it hitched a ride on asteroids, or rode in on comets, or drifted between solar systems like spores in a cosmic breeze. It's not as fringe as it sounds. In fact, amino acids, the basic ingredients of life, have been detected in meteorites, even sugar molecules, even DNA-like compounds. That's not science fiction. That's just science getting uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether panspermia is likely, or simply the easiest way to outsource the problem of life's origin. We don't know where life came from. Fine, maybe it came from somewhere else. A shrug wrapped in stardust. But tonight, we're taking it one step further. What if not just life arrived from elsewhere? What if intelligence did? You reach a ridge and stop. The landscape opens below you into a plain of broken glass, volcanic, not artificial, and yet the symmetry is unnerving. Long ridges like fingers, craters like impact sites. You tell yourself it's just geology. Probably, but the idea keeps humming. Maybe intelligence didn't evolve here slowly from trilobites and fish. Maybe it landed here, not in ships but in cells, spores, encoded in viral genomes. Maybe Earth was never a blank page but an invited host. Picture this, a species on a dying planet billions of years ago. They know extinction is coming, star collapse, planetary drift, a biological collapse of their own making. So they prepare a seed, not a ship full of scientists, but a biological package, self-replicating, adaptive, silent. They launch it into the cosmos. They don't know where it will land, only that if it does and if conditions are right, it will begin again. Not as them, not as copies, but as echoes built from local materials, shaped by the new environment, but carrying a fingerprint of the old mind. And maybe one of those seeds landed here. And maybe it grew. Not in a straight line, not quickly, but in pulses, bursts, flourishes and failures. Life erupting, diversifying, collapsing, resetting, and then intelligence. Not necessarily human, maybe reptilian, maybe aquatic, maybe fungal, but aware, and familiar in a way we can't quite name. What if Earth's earliest civilization was the awakening of that seed? You sit on a boulder and think about your own DNA. It's weird, you know, full of junk sequences, so-called non-coding regions that don't do much, at least not that we understand. But what if that junk isn't junk at all? What if it's metadata, an archive? Some scientists have floated the idea that DNA could be used as storage, a biological hard drive capable of holding massive amounts of information. What if someone already used it that way? And what if we're not just descendants of the first Earth civilization, but its data storage system? A living library, a walking memory. And the best part, we don't even know what we're carrying. You remember that time in 2013 when scientists accidentally reactivated a virus frozen in Siberian permafrost for 30,000 years. It still worked, still replicated. Now stretch that concept to intelligence. Maybe something ancient is sleeping inside us or around us, waiting to be noticed. Or worse, waiting to be reawakened. Here's your fringe morsel of the night. A few researchers, not mainstream but not mad either, have proposed that octopuses may be alien-derived. Not in the spaceship sense, but because their genes don't line up neatly with anything else. Their nervous systems are bizarre. Their brains are decentralized. They can rewrite their RNA on the fly. One paper even called them a genetic anomaly that seems to appear out of nowhere. Historians still argue whether that's just evolution being weird or something more. But you think back to your time in the tide pools of your imagination, the spiral minds, the slow cities. Maybe the octopus isn't a relic. Maybe it's a scout. You lie back now on the obsidian slope, staring up into a sky that feels like an ocean turned inside out. The stars are scattered too casually. They've seen this before. And then the final thought arrives, quiet and terrible. What if we're not the children of Earth's first civilization? What if we're the soil it left behind? And now, as you breathe in the night air, tinged with the memory of other worlds, you finally understand. The first civilization may not have vanished. It may simply be waiting to grow again. Inside us. The stars overhead are thick now, like glitter spilled across black velvet. Some shimmer blue, others burn red. A few are too still, too precise, and you wonder, just for a moment, if they're watching. Not stars at all, but memories looking down. You rise from the obsidian slope and begin walking again, feet crunching against volcanic glass as the air cools around you. The terrain is shifting once more, smoothing into low hills and open plains. Everything feels post-event. Not ruined exactly, not broken, just after. A landscape that has moved on from something enormous and left no obituary behind. And that brings you to one of the oldest, most whispered questions in deep time speculation. Do civilizations rise in cycles? You already know the Earth has been through cataclysms, not one or two, but dozens. The Permian extinction wiped out over 90% of marine species. The Cretaceous extinction killed the dinosaurs, and those are just the famous ones. There are quieter resets, ice ages, supervolcanoes, climate whiplashes. The world builds, collapses, rebuilds. So why not civilization? Maybe Earth doesn't host just one arc of intelligence, but many. Not a straight line, but a series of waves, each one climbing toward consciousness, only to crash into extinction or retreat back into the noise. You reach a dry riverbed and follow it, the stones beneath your feet polished smooth by water that hasn't flowed for millions of years. The path winds gently, almost like it remembers being useful, like it was carved with purpose. And here's the thought that really hums tonight. What if we're not the first civilization, and we won't be the last? We assume that our existence is a pinnacle, one shining spike in Earth's history, but maybe we're just the latest in a series of rises. Maybe this is attempt number 5, or 20, or 200. Historians still argue whether humanity itself has gone through forgotten cycles, golden ages buried beneath bronze, pre-ice age cultures that may have been more advanced than we know. Think of the lost cities whispered about in myth: Atlantis, Lemuria, Qumri Kandom. Most scholars dismiss these as legends, symbolic stories of human hubris. But symbols can echo truths. Take Göbekli Tepe, for instance. Discovered in Turkey, this megalithic site dates back over 11,000 years, thousands of years older than Stonehenge or the pyramids. It upended our understanding of prehistoric society. Before agriculture, before writing, before even pottery, someone built temples, with purpose, with planning. So what else might be waiting under layers we haven't touched yet? Or under layers we can't even reach? You pass a weathered stone slab half buried in the soil. It's nothing special at first, just a boulder perhaps, but on the far side faint lines intersect at right angles. You wipe the dirt away. The surface is fractured but not shattered, too smooth, too thin. You feel that familiar suspicion. Not again, not another almost thing. But here's the honest truth. Deep time doesn't care about confirmation. It only leaves fragments, blurs, whispers, and maybe that's all it can leave. Imagine a civilization that thrived during the Jurassic period, one that built with organic materials, one that understood biology better than we do now, but never needed computers or satellites or skyscrapers. A slow-burning intelligence that left behind living structures instead of fossilized monuments. Now fast forward 60 million years, what would be left? Not the structures, not the artifacts, just changes, traces in carbon. A thin layer of sediment slightly more metallic, a fossilized creature with an oddly fused joint, a few unexplainable isotope ratios. Nothing you could point to and say, yes, this was a civilization. Just ripples. And those ripples may come again. Because here's your quirky fact of the night. After every major extinction event, Earth doesn't go quiet. It rebounds, hard. Life surges back in strange, experimental waves. Mammals took over after the dinosaurs. Birds reinvented flight. Octopuses re-evolved intelligence in a completely different body plan. Over and over, Earth resets, then reboots. What if civilizations do the same? One rises, one falls. The next picks up a different thread, not connected by lineage but by opportunity, by conditions, by pure statistical inevitability. Maybe there's an intelligence baking right now, deep in the oceans, in some unfamiliar genome, or in fungal networks stretching across continents, or in AI systems flickering to life in server racks that hum while we sleep. Maybe we are just one chapter in an ancient book of experiments, one attempt in a very long line. And maybe the last civilization left just enough behind, a nudge, a pattern, an instinct. Maybe that's why we build cities in grids, why we look to the stars, why certain numbers feel holy, why spiral shapes feel right, not because they're logical, but because we inherited them. Not through DNA, through recurrence. Historians still debate whether cultural memory can survive without writing, but you know that some stories, some ideas cling like seeds to the wind. They don't need pages. Just time, just echo. You reach a plateau now where the dry riverbed ends. In the distance, hills rise like waves frozen mid-motion. The wind stirs dust around your boots, and for a brief second it feels like everything stops, like the land is waiting for something. And you realize maybe it's not done. Not yet. Maybe something else will rise here again. Long after us, long after our cities crumble and our satellites fall, long after plastic becomes dust and skyscrapers become sediment. Maybe something else will look up at the stars and wonder, were we the first? And maybe it'll find you, This you, this version, this attempt, written faintly into the Earth's palimpsest. You sit on the edge of the plateau now, legs dangling over ancient stone as the night pulls itself fully across the sky. The stars are bright and sharp, cold even, the kind of stars that look older than light should. And somewhere out there in that infinite black shimmer, a single question turns in your mind like a key in a slow, grinding lock. What lies beneath the layer we're not allowed to touch? You've walked through forests of coral, climbed mountains that might have been machines, listened to echoes carved into rock by things we don't have names for. But now, you've come to the most forbidden place of all. The forbidden layer. The place no one dares to dig too far into. Not because they're hiding something, not because it's booby-trapped or guarded by secret societies, but because of something far more frustrating. We physically can't get to it. Let's break this down. You know how deep the deepest human-made hole is? Just over 12 kilometers. It's called the Kola Superdeep Borehole, and it took Soviet scientists decades to drill it. They weren't looking for Atlantis or time capsules, just data, seismic readings, rock samples, but what they found instead was a limit. The heat, the pressure, the unexpectedness of the geology, everything below that point became too strange, too unstable, too uncooperative. The rocks didn't behave the way they were supposed to. The seismic readings got fuzzy, and then they stopped drilling. 12 kilometers. That's less than the length of a city bus route, on a planet that's over 12,000 kilometers in diameter. We've barely scratched the surface, literally. Historians still argue whether we should even try to go deeper. Some say we've learned enough through indirect readings, like seismic waves from earthquakes. Others say we're missing something critical, but nobody argues this. There's a whole planet beneath our feet, and most of it is a complete mystery. So you ask yourself, with that whispering suspicion crawling back in, what if something is hidden down there? Not a city, not a spaceship, but a layer, one that marks a time before time. A civilization buried not just by sediment but by intent, perhaps even by its own hand. You look out over the plains stretching in every direction and you remember something else. There's a region in the Earth's crust called the Mohorovičić discontinuity, or the MOHO, if you prefer it less tongue-twisty. It's the boundary between the Earth's crust and its mantle. And here's the strange part, we've never actually reached it. We think we know it's there based on how seismic waves behave, but no drill has ever gotten close. We just assume it exists because the math says so. But what if the MOHO isn't just a geological boundary? What if it's a membrane? The line where one world ends and another begins. A few researchers, quiet ones, the kind who get laughed out of conferences but whispered about in emails, have proposed the idea that Earth might have ancient subcrustal anomalies, regions of metal that don't match natural formation, cavities that shouldn't exist, even structures that reflect seismic waves in oddly deliberate ways. Most mainstream geologists shrug. It's complicated, they say. Rocks are weird. And they're not wrong. But you're not convinced they're right either. Because here's your fringe treat for the night. In 1995, a team of geophysicists studying the mantle transition zone found an area beneath China that reflected seismic waves like a metal dome. No one could explain it. It didn't fit any known model, so it was quietly ignored. What if that wasn't an anomaly? What if it was a lid? Imagine a civilization that flourished hundreds of millions of years ago. One that saw what was coming, an extinction, a cosmic event, a planetary shift, and didn't flee to space, but instead went down. deep into the crust, past the reach of ice ages and solar flares, past the layers that shift and break and subduct, into a zone of relative thermal stability. A place to wait, to sleep, to hibernate, to endure. You touch the stone beneath you again. It feels not hollow but buffered, like it's shielding something. What if this layer, this forbidden depth, isn't just geologic? What if it's a choice? A vault, not made of steel but of mantle, not filled with gold but with memory. Structures that use geothermal gradients to power themselves. Ecosystems designed to survive in chemical darkness. Minds that think in slow loops, conserving energy for the moment they're needed again. And maybe that moment hasn't come yet. Or maybe it's coming soon. Historians still debate whether myths of underworlds and hollow earths are pure fantasy, or the fractured retellings of something dimly remembered. The Agartha myth, the Shambhala legends, the tales of gods retreating into the earth when the skies turned black, these appear in cultures continents apart. Coincidence? Or echo? You sit now at the edge of the night, legs tucked in, wrapped in the soundless hush of a planet still dreaming, and it hits you. We're building upward towers, satellites, telescopes, reaching for the stars with desperate, heroic confidence. But maybe we've been facing the wrong direction. Maybe the real archive isn't above us. Maybe it's below, waiting in the dark, waiting for a species clever enough or foolish enough to dig too deep, to reach the locked door and knock. And maybe when that knock comes, something will knock back. You lie awake now, flat on your back, staring into a sky so rich with stars it seems more like an ocean than a ceiling. And you feel small, not in the helpless way, but in the connected way. Like a single note in a song you haven't heard the beginning of, or maybe you're in the middle, or maybe you're the bridge. But either way, you're no longer asking if Earth's first civilization existed. Not really. Now you're asking, why would they disappear? Why would they hide? Because we've wandered far together, through oceans and canyons, coral mines and stone spirals, buried structures and biological memory. And the deeper the mystery gets, the more it starts to feel like a decision. Not an accident, not a cataclysm, but a choice. Which leaves you with one aching question, swirling through the silence like dust. If someone came before us, why aren't they here now? You roll slowly to your side, fingers tracing patterns in the dust, and you consider the possibilities, each one stranger and more poetic than the last. Maybe the first civilization didn't collapse. Maybe it ascended, not in a laser beam to the sky kind of way, but in the quieter sense. A cultural transcendence, a deliberate unplugging. They reached a point where further growth wasn't vertical but inward. No monuments, no empires, just release. Historians still argue whether civilizations naturally reach a point of technological singularity or spiritual burnout. Some claim we're approaching such a moment ourselves, a threshold where progress begins to consume itself. More data, less meaning, more power, less wisdom. What if they crossed that line and chose not to keep going? Maybe they saw the edge and stepped away. Not as failure, as philosophy. You remember that ancient Sufi concept of the perfect silence, the idea that truth is not spoken, but lived, and that the greatest teachings are carried not in words, but in presence. Could an entire civilization come to that conclusion? What if the first intelligent beings on Earth didn't die in fire and rubble, but simply withdrew? What if they became invisible on purpose? Now here's your fringe idea of the night. Some thinkers, usually dismissed with raised eyebrows and polite coughs, have suggested that Earth may host crypto-terrestrial intelligences. Not aliens from elsewhere, not time travelers, just beings that never left, that live among us, hidden, camouflaged, blended so well into ecosystems or underground networks that we don't recognize them. Or maybe they manipulate perception itself. Not in UFOs, not in cloaks, but in absence, in perfect hiding. You rise and walk again, the ground warming slightly underfoot from some slow geothermal pulse. The path winds into a narrow slot canyon, walls so tight they seem to lean in toward each other. As you slide between them, you run your fingers along the stone and feel patterns, barely their ridges in rhythmic formation. Not random, not natural, not entirely. What if the first civilization never wanted to be found? Maybe they saw what came before them, species rising, consuming, conquering, and chose another path. A life of minimal footprint, a mode of intelligence that left no plastic, no smoke, no satellites, just balance. A world so deeply integrated with nature that it looked like nature itself. You remember termites again, coral reefs, ants with agriculture, octopuses that vanish into their environment not through magic but through perfect design. You don't need to leave Earth to find invisibility. You just need to understand camouflage. Historians still debate whether certain ancient cultural motifs, serpents, watchers, shadow beings, represent myth, metaphor, or memory. Why do so many indigenous traditions speak of the old ones, the ones who came first, taught, and left? Sometimes they're gods, sometimes animals, sometimes just voices in the stone. Maybe they're all the same story, told through different mouths. And what if their disappearance wasn't failure, but a test? You picture a species that sees its own technological rise as a rehearsal, not the final act, but a gauntlet. Can they survive their own potential? Can they build and still remain part of the web? Or do they burn too brightly, consume too fast? If they fail, reset. If they succeed, transcend. And if we are here now, maybe that means someone came before us, walked the line and made the ultimate decision, to leave behind only hints. A few carved stones, a strange layer in the crust, a resonance in a canyon, a spiral in a tree, a song in our bones. Because maybe we weren't meant to find ruins. Maybe we were meant to remember a feeling. Not proof, not certainty, just that itch behind your thoughts, that odd sensation that you're not the first to stand here in this exact spot asking these exact questions. You step out of the canyon and into a wide, flat valley under the stars. The wind moves in long, sweeping arcs, as if tracing invisible lines across the plain. You stand still and listen. Nothing. Or maybe everything. Maybe they're still here. Not above, not beneath, but between. And maybe, just maybe, they're waiting. Not to be discovered, but to see what kind of story we choose to write. The stars overhead begin to drift, slowly, subtly, as if the sky itself is shifting gears, transitioning from one dream into another. You're still standing in that quiet valley, your breath soft in the cooling air, the dust around your feet undisturbed. Nothing moves, but everything feels like it's listening. Because now, finally, the question has turned inward. Not what if Earth's first civilization wasn't human. Not where did they go. But what does that make us? You walk again, quietly now, barefoot across soil so old it may have once been the roof of something. The land ahead is flat and empty. No trees, no stone formations, no spirals or grooves to trace with your fingers. Just a field of absence, and still that familiar hum beneath your feet, faint, gentle, like a distant memory warming through the floorboards of time. If something came before us and chose to disappear, to go underground, to dissolve into biology or energy or myth, then who are we in that story? Maybe not successors, maybe not replacements. Maybe we are echoes. You pause, standing still under the same sky that billions of other eyes, human and not, have stared into. And for the first time tonight, you let the idea in fully. We might not be the first. We might not be the last. We might just be the next. Part of a cycle, one of many. A verse in a long, looping poem written in DNA, in stone, in silence. And maybe it's not even our job to be the heroes of this story. Maybe we're the listeners, the record keepers, the ones who catch the faint signal just before it fades completely. And that signal, it's us. Our curiosity, our impulse to dig, to wonder, to imagine, to remember things we never learned. You find a place to sit. The soil here is soft, powdery, and oddly warm, like it's been holding heat since the Carboniferous. You press your hands into it and feel it give just slightly, like memory, like the past still has room left for you. Here's something to anchor you. In 2020, a researcher studying cave art in Indonesia discovered a depiction of a pig, over 45,000 years old, the oldest known representational artwork made by a human. And yet, the way it was drawn, confident, stylized, almost casual, suggested the artist was part of a long tradition, one that started much earlier. That pig wasn't a beginning, it was a middle. Historians still argue whether we'll ever find the true start of human culture. But maybe that's because culture doesn't start. It emerges, it collects, it builds from whatever came before, even if that before is gone. So now ask yourself, what if we are someone's art? Not metaphorically. What if the species that came first left us behind, not as descendants but as creations? A final act, not of ego, but of hope. You can feel it now, that quiet idea settling into your chest like a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. Maybe Earth's first civilization wasn't erased. Maybe it wasn't buried. Maybe it became us. Their knowledge encoded not in servers or scrolls, but in the only medium that survives deep time, biology. Not memory in the brain, but instinct in the bones. Not language in the mouth, but symbols in the dreams. Not maps in the sand, but questions in the soul. That's why the spirals feel familiar. Why the ocean hums with déjà vu. Why the stars look less like a ceiling and more like a home you left too long ago. You stand again, brushing the dust from your hands, and look out over the valley one last time. There are no ruins here, no lights, no artifacts, but you feel more watched, more connected, more seen than ever. Because this has never been a hunt for objects. This has always been a journey through your own inheritance, your place in the long, looping chain of intelligence that visits this world, changes it, and then lets go. And now it's your chapter. Our chapter. The page is open. So what will you leave behind? A mountain, a monument, a field of plastic, or maybe something subtler. A new way of listening, of seeing, of living. Because maybe the real question isn't whether they were ever here. Maybe the question is whether we'll deserve the same memory. And whether someone, millions of years from now, will feel your footprint in the dust and whisper, they were here, they were trying, they matter.